And I'm not Mark. See the meet. Sometimes it takes a second to show. Two attendees so far. Yes, it is. See Mark on video, but no. That's no. No.
Live.
We're live, so if we want to just let everybody know that.
All right, we're just working on a little technical difficulty. We'll be starting in a minute, meeting in 1 minute.
He has to accept the
Yeah,
promotion.
yes, guys, keep on as an attendee rather than.
So I'll move her as a panelist and then make her and then I'll add a little bit of now this is on that pan.
We're going to get started in packed agenda. All right, I'm going to call a meeting of the Board Finance Committee to order at 3:33 on May 5th. We're going to start with public comment on non-agenda and agenda items. So is there any public comment?
There are no blue cards for public comment.
All right, so seeing no public comment, we'll go ahead and move on to items 3, discussion and action. Everything we have today is discussion items. We do have a packed agenda. I still plan on ending us at 5:30. So if we don't get to item D, the budget process, ongoing work plan discussion, with enough time to really engage in it, we're going to go ahead and push that to our next meeting and we'll figure out the work plan from there. So I'm going to go ahead and go to item 3A, discussion on the comparative budget study. And I just want to start us off by thanking that this, I think, was in part genesis of work that had already started, but also part of our CBSA Masters in Governance coursework, where they showed me one of these. And so I'm glad that we're able to use this to kind of ground a lot of the discussions we're having. And with that, I'll pass it over to Lisa August and Emmanuel Bardelli.
So I just want to give a big thank you and shout out to Dr. Bardelli for creating this phenomenal comparative tool for us. It's something that a lot of districts contract out and it has a significant cost. Emmanuel was able to take some data and really dig down deep, and so I'm going to hand it over to him to share.
Yeah. The tool is also available online. The link is on the agendas for today. But today we are going to go through a presentation. I do have a series of takeaways that I noticed as I was going through. But if it's okay with the group, I'm just going to go through the pictures instead, and then we can go through and see the takeaways by pictures instead of in words. So we are going to cover 3 things today. We are going to take a look at average daily attendance. That is the main source of revenue for the district. We are going to take a look at the budget allocations. And then finally, we are going to end with some data from HR around salary schedules and ADA to FTE assignments. Okay, so to start off with ADA, I know this has been a hot topic because we always talked about ADA. So in this table, we have the ADA estimate or pretty much changes starting from 2016 all the way to 2013. Here, school year are presented with the first year. So 2016 is 2016-17 school year, and 2023 is for the 2023-2024 school year, which is last school year. That is the last data that is available online. The state is just now releasing interim 2 for this school year, so they are about 4 months behind in the release. So here, before we start going into the data, let's look at what we are comparing. So the first row is San Jose City Schools. That's us. That combines our elementary and secondary districts into online.
Does it also include charter?
And also includes charter. So it's pretty much all ADA, including charter schools. Neighbors, these are selected group of districts. It includes pretty much all our neighboring secondary high school districts, and including also Napa and Vallejo City. So it's pretty much, if you think about if they have a high school and they are either in Sonoma County, or is Napa Valley Unified or Vallejo, they are in this line. Sonoma County includes all other Sonoma County school districts, which is mostly elementary school districts. And then the 4 extra lines are the comparative studies. So what I did, I tried to match Santa Rosa City Schools with other districts in California, depending on those 4 characteristics: enrollment, percentage of English language learners, percentage of students with disabilities, and percentage of socioeconomically disadvantaged students. I chose percentage instead of numbers so that we could, kind of like say, we have about, 10% English language learners. You could imagine that the budget allocations for district with a similar percentage of English language learners might be similar to ours, rather than saying districts that have 3,000 English language learners, but they might be much bigger or much smaller than us. And so there is enrollment, English learners, students with ability and socioeconomic disadvantage. Altogether, the program has identified about 50 districts, and I keep all districts that are within 2 percentage points from the Santa Rosa City School observation. So basically 2 percentage points above or below what we have Santa Rosa City Schools. Okay, so now if we use 2016-17 as our baseline, and we compare to last year's attendance numbers, I know that the discussion is always that we have seen a decline in enrollment, and the data shows that Santa Rosa City School lost about 11% of their students, 11.5%. So we started from about 14,800 students, and last year we reported 13,010, right, or 100. How do we compare with other districts? So if you look at the table, you can see that other districts in the county appear to have lost more students than what we did, right? So neighboring high school districts lost an average of 17%, and other Sonoma County schools lost about 16%. So we are not doing any worse than our neighbors. We are almost, seems like we are losing fewer students on average. Now, when we compare with our comparative districts, the story is largely similar. When we look at enrollments, we see that districts that are similar size as Santa Rosa City Schools lost about 7% of students. And this is mostly, the percentage is actually the same. There is actually one outlier down in Southern California that has that pretty much is double in size. It's in South LA, I believe it's right by the new SoFi Stadium. Lennox? It's Bell something. Oh, McCarthy? Yeah, and I think it's because of the SoFi development. A lot of new families moved into those neighborhoods that got revitalized, and so they doubled. And so that percentage is a little bit skewed just by that one district. But I think it's the only example in California that's growing rather than declining. All the other districts are English learners, students with disabilities, again, it's kind of like the same. Socioeconomically disadvantaged, it appears they lost a little bit fewer students. They are also smaller. As you can see, they have about 7,000 students. So it's difficult to know. My takeaway is that, yes, we experienced a decline, not as big as a decline as other districts in Sonoma County at least, and similar to other districts in California.
So it's based off of average daily attendance,
Yeah.
not enrollment. So as you were looking at the data, is there any differential in number of students enrolled versus ADA? Are we being more successful in people attending?
That's a good question. I don't know that. I didn't look at comparison of ADA and enrollment. That's a good
Okay.
point. I believe our ADA or our, I don't say ADA, but our attendance percentage has been pretty much similar at around 92%. Also, during the pandemic, I think ADA was assigned on enrollment and not on attendance, so it gets a little bit like complicated, so.
It was basically held harmless at the attendance rate from February of 2020.
Yeah, and
So that was kind of set as the bar for a while.
yeah, and so like in 2022, you can see like maybe it went up a little bit enrollment, and that's mostly because of that whole harmless pin at the February level. All right. So this is pretty much around attendance. Let's keep in mind this 10% because you're going to come back to this towards the end of the presentation as an interesting data point. Okay, so the next one, we actually did a graph in case you don't like to read numbers. Sometimes it's nicer to see the change. And you can see the black line is center of the city schools. It's right there in the middle of the pack, right? And then another thing that's interesting, at least to me, is that if you compare the lines before and after the pandemic, and here I colored the pandemic in blue, you can see that the ADA for San Jose City School was pretty much flat. And after the pandemic is pretty much flat, right? And so we are not like losing students after the pandemic. We didn't lose students before the pandemic. It's just that we lost a lot of students during the pandemic. So basically they either left the county, they, they decided not to come back after the pandemic, right? And this pattern kind of like it follows pretty much all other districts in California where there is this big decline during the pandemic, and then students never came back and are all back. Okay, so now let's jump then into the budget, right? So here we are going to take a look at budget allocations by object. So when you think about an object code is on what we are spending money on, right? And so when we think about objects is the what in our budget. We have a lot of codes. We go from code 1,000 to 7,000. I didn't want to list them all, so I kind of put them into bigger buckets. So we can see I started with certificated admin salaries and certificated teacher salaries. Then there is classified admin and classified staff. And then there is benefits regardless of class, they are all together. Books and supplies, services and operating costs, capital outlay and equipment, and other costs. From left to right, again, we have our comparisons starting from San Jose City Schools and going all the way to the socioeconomically disadvantaged comparison group. These numbers use amount of student dollars per student spent, so that when we look at a cell, even if a district has a different size as San Jose City Schools, they should be more or less comparable, right? So starting from top to bottom, there are two numbers or two cells that stood out to me when I read this table. And I bolded them. The first one is how much we spend per student on certificated teacher salaries. And the second one is how much we spend on services and operating costs per student. So if you look at and start comparing across, right? San Jose City Schools spends about $5,811 per student on certificated teachers. That is about $1,000 less than our Sonoma County neighbors, and it's more or less in line with other comparative districts.
$1,000 more?
More, sorry, yes, and about, I don't know how much the average is, but it would be $500 more in our comparative districts. So all in all, it's a little bit difficult to know why this is happening, and we are going to dig a little bit more today for what we can see. one thing that is interesting is that we spend about the same, if you look at the English language learner cell. So maybe we are subsidizing or adding money from restricted sources to support our English language learners, and that could result in a higher average expenditure, right?
I just,
Yeah,
make sure I'm understanding the data correctly. A higher number here could be the result of, not, it wouldn't just be the result of higher salaries, but it could be the result of lower classroom sizes, right?
yes,
So
and
if we have
that's,
more classrooms operating. So this isn't saying we're overpaying or we're necessarily each individual teacher is receiving
Yeah.
more. It's how much we're spending in total.
correct.
Okay.
And you're nailing it right in, on the head. Our class sizes are on average smaller than our neighbors, about, and we are going to take a look, 17:1 versus 18:1. So we do have smaller class sizes. It does not appear that we are paying more than our neighbors, and we are going to see, well, we might be paying more, but at least the year-to-year increases are not more than our neighbors, right? And so this is not driven by salary increases, right?
Right, it could
Um,
all, some of that is also when you think of the additional supports that we've provided over the years, specifically with TOSAs, our
Yeah.
teachers on special assignment, things like that.
So that's also all driving that. And then, let me see.
Just so we're all understanding the factors that go into the.
Yes.
into the discussion.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yeah, right.
So could you see the same thing like, when it comes to like, a TOSA, like an EO TOSA, for example, showing up under that first column, also showing up under English learners?
And we are going to see that right now. So I did split apart now by budget object, right? Because I think those are the questions we are asking. So, they are really reported in three big categories, which is certificated teacher salaries. These are direct salaries that support classroom teachers. And then there is pupil support, which is instead everything else that is not in the classroom, right? So counselors, those other kind of stuff. And then there is something that's captured into others, which is pretty much a bucket that gets everything that is not in this shoe. So like here, right, again, you can see that we are still spending a little bit more on direct certificated teacher salaries. A little bit more on pupil support. And pretty much a little bit more also on certificated teacher salaries. So by looking at this, it's kind of difficult to make sense, right? It seems that we are everything, and then, everything can really be an explanation. We could have smaller class sizes, more pupil support, and also more other certificated teacher salaries expenses. So it's a little bit hodgepodge of everything. Now going to Dr. Castor's question, can we see the expenses like in this others category, which in my mind could be, supporting, through out of classroom personnel. On average, again, it's $172 per student. For districts that have similar number of English language learners versus about $250 for us. So, yeah. So that is for the certificated teacher. Now, if we dive into the services and operating cost budgets, this is budget code 5,000. Pretty much anything that is related to operating costs of the district is captured under this budget code. You can see that, goes anything from sub-agreements for services. This is, contracts for services, all the way to, communications, rentals and so on. If you start comparing the columns, the one that really stood out to me is the sub-agreement for services. We spend about $2,000 per student on this category versus, $500 for our neighbors, $1,300 for Sonoma County, and about, $600 for our comparative districts, right? And so this is really driving up our costs, almost like 3 to 4 times more than what we would expect when we compare to our partners.
And there can be a couple reasons for that. One, we know that we're spending substantially more related to contract services for special education, in the classroom.
I think we're about to see that.
Yes, that's also going to cover, that's likely to cover our transportation through West County, if you think it, because we contract for that rather than providing our own, so that's where you'll see a difference. Like some other districts actually provide their own transportation, so you're not going to see it in the sub-agreements piece. You're gonna see that more in some of
Where's
the other
the-
costs.
Is the transportation in here? Or is this just general fund numbers?
It's, transportation isn't general
Oh, yes.
fund. It will also, cover, there are some grants that we receive funds and then actually contract and pay services, so it's not necessarily an apples to apples, there may be multiple factors.
So now here, looking at the goals, now, right, why we are spending the money.
Mhm.
You can see that, as Ms. August was saying, the special education goal is really driving these expenses, right? So more than half of all our expenses under the sub-agreements for services, $1,400 per student is spent on special education contracts. And this is, kind of like an outlier. If you look, none of the comparable districts spend as much. And we spend, $1,000 more even that, on average in our neighbors in Sonoma County. All in all, right, the other ones are comparable, right? Now we're looking, here and there, but it should be pretty much comparable there. So really, two things, right, stand out from this. The first one is the certificated teacher salaries expense, and then the services for the sub-agreements for services, one.
So just to clarify, so the sub-agreements for services appears that the primary thing is our instructional aid sped issue.
Instructional aids, and also we do track the goal is going to include those transportation services that are specific.
And
to
that's
special
also in
education.
5760. Okay, so that includes
Yeah.
both the special ed aids and the transportation.
Yes.
Yeah,
And, depending
that was the
on,
part that wasn't connecting my brain. Thank you.
and depending on what we are transporting or who we are transporting, right? Some of them might be charged to the regular education here, and some of them might be charged to the special education. So depending on who's the student that's getting transported and the why you're spending the money, it gets split across those goals. Okay. Now we can look at the salary schedule. This is a little bit small, but again, in black, you have Santa Rosa City Schools. And then the other lines of the spaghettis are our neighbors. This shows the salary schedule change using 2015 as the baseline for a range 4 and a regular teacher with a master's degree. So I think it's called BA plus 30 on the salary schedule. So you can see here that the black line is the line for Santa Rosa City Schools. The increase that this salary range experience is not out of line than our neighbors, right? And so when we start thinking about, okay, what might be driving that increase in, certificated teacher salaries, is it salary increases? The answer is certainly no, right? We don't see us being outliers. At most, we are right in line. And before the pandemic, we were actually below. So yes, we have given, maybe higher increases during the pandemic and after. That could also be seen also as almost a catch up to our neighbors and other comparative districts there. Now going back to the other question, how about class size or ADA per FTE? Here instead, we do see Santa Rosa City Schools, again, it's the black line, to be significantly lower than everybody else that we can find in our panel, except with the Sonoma County elementary school districts. And this is mostly due to them a lot of them be very small, right? Less than 100 students. So if you have 4 teachers for 100 students teaching 3 grades each, you end up with a low ratio just because you don't have enough kids and you cannot, go below 1 or 2 FTEs really. And so here you can see that even pre-pandemic, Santa Rosa City School was at about 11 students per adult. After the pandemic, we are all the way down to almost 16 per student per student. Sorry, 16 students per adult.
So we're just over 18 students per adult in like the 2015 era.
Exactly.
And now we've basically increased the number of adults or decreased the number of students. We're down around 16.
Exactly. And remember, this is 2013, so this was all pre-adjustments to the FTEs that happened last school year and this school year. Right, and so this.
2023.
Yes, sorry, 2023. And so it does not include any of the reduction in force that were implemented last year and are going to be implemented for next school year.
And just so I understand
Mhm.
this, that's not our class size ratio. That would be a mix between the fact that we have some sections that are
Yeah.
that have 10, 11 students, and we have some sections that have 30 plus. This is like the average.
This is the average. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is where this gets a little bit confusing, is that Central City Schools operates as a K-12 district, right? A unified district, even if we aren't a unified district. So, and just mechanically, given how the state gives out allocations for ADA, elementary school districts tend to be smaller than high school districts, right? Because the state is funding a reduction in class sizes, grades K-3. And that is also part of why the Sonoma County is so low, because all of them are elementary school districts, right? So, but on the other hand, the Central City School is a mostly secondary district, right? We are split about 70-30. So our line should be more or closer to our neighbors, which is actually the very top one at about 20 students per adult, rather than, for example, the lower line, which is the Sonoma County elementary districts. So, yes, so.
Right, because our TK classes are going to be limited to 20 students.
Exactly, by law.
By law,
Starting
starting next
Yeah.
year, so. But we're not putting 33 TKers
Yes,
into it, right?
correct.
So
Yeah, it's 24.
it's 24, yeah,
Yes.
so.
Exactly.
Okay.
So plus size, yes, it's definitely driving our costs. And that is pretty much all I have for today. We are at about time. And this is kind of like a list of the comparative districts in case, people are curious. There is much more available online if people want to go on. You can dig into more, codes and so on, but this is pretty much my take, having played with the data.
Any questions? Trustee Kirby is experiencing technical issues, so I'm sure he'll have some follow-up questions after this, but I really appreciate you putting this together. I think it's good for us to start to see the benchmarks. My two follow-up with questions would be the enrollment question, and then also if we can get an understanding of the division of transportation versus the instructional aid issues in the 5760. I think it'd be good to know, because I feel like we have a lot of attention on the instructional aid. And if there's also a need for us to have a lot of attention on the transportation, it'd be good to know the significance.
Yes, and that's something actually that, I was thinking John was in here, it's not. John did have me come in and speak with his program managers about, and this is something that we've been talking about as far as when we should be providing specialized, transportation specific within the IEP versus transportation for a special education student on a general education bus, because there's a difference in how we pay in the cost and how we pay for that.
And we can do follow-up. At this point, I'd just like to know how much of that. And then we can go from there.
Will do.
Any follow-up from your end?
I have questions about salary schedules, but I don't know how to form my questions. I've been looking at schedules of a lot of districts, and there are some that are a lot lower than us and some that are a lot higher. So it seems that, we're kind of in the average, but I guess I'm wondering, like, if the districts that pay higher than us if they are better funded than us.
Right, are they community funded, basically,
Yeah.
districts or?
Cause
No.
like, I look at this and I think, wow, I would make a lot more money if I taught here than in Roanoke Park.
Yes, no, and that's a very good point, especially with Roanoke Park. I also have friends, my mother-in-law worked at Roanoke Park. And the big difference is what you need to take a look at is the total compensation package. So when you just look at the salary schedule, you're just looking at what goes in your paycheck, not what the district pays to be with you, right? And so, and unfortunately, I can't include the benefit package, right? But Roanoke Park, for example, if you just look at the salary schedule, appears that they are paying lower, but they contribute more to your benefits. And so at the end, you will end up spending less out of pocket to get benefits. I don't know if that makes any sense, right? And so it evens out in the end, right? And so it's not just direct salary, it's salary plus benefits that really matters when we look at this. Unfortunately, our benefits reporting is not usable at this time, and so it's difficult to make a nice comparison.
Yeah, didn't we make a significant increase to benefits with our last negotiation?
Yes, for a long time, there wasn't a cap provided at all for benefits, it was correct. Here at Santa Rosa City Schools.
They had negotiated to remove them to put it all to its salaries.
Yeah.
And then it came back and the new negotiations. It's like 2017, started coming back.
And my guess for the employee is $1 spent through benefits is more beneficial because they don't pay income tax on them. Is that consistent?
So that really depends on their personal situation as far as. So. We don't want to get into.
Yeah,
what
I was
it
asking
costs
generically.
Right, so if they are spending money on. Say a pre-tax basis for benefits, it would cost them less because that would be removed from their
Pre-tax.
taxable income. Versus for us, as far as cost to the district, it costs us less to provide an increase on the benefit side than on the salary side, because there aren't statutory costs that go into the benefits. You don't pay the STRS or PERS or, Social Security, those things on those dollars. So it's,
Benefits
it's a
can have
balance.
marginal benefit. Benefits can be marginally better financially. Marginal.
Yeah, it depends on how they choose to do that. Also, there are flexible spending accounts and things like that they can use to maximize those.
Okay.
Those pre-tax dollars.
Does that get towards your question?
Yeah, yes.
The other thing that I've noticed, looking at the salary schedules, is when they cap out. And so it's not just looking at the percentage of money, it's also when people stop receiving yearly increases. And so those are called steps, right? And our salary schedule stops at step 11 for some teachers and goes all the way to 37 for others, depending on how many units you have. And so, if you are capped out at 11, you won't receive a step increase unless we give out a percentage increase year to year. And most of our teachers that are in this situation are actually at the cap. And so that is also another thing to keep in mind, is when we look at salary schedules, it's not just how much we pay, but also the distribution of teachers on the salary schedule. And I know that Joel and I always talk about this because it appears that our teacher population skews a little bit on the more experienced side, which means it's also on the more experienced or more expensive on the salary schedule.
Yeah, and Santa Rosa City Schools also negotiated a change in there was a change negotiated a time ago where teachers coming in can bring all of their experience versus many districts capped the salary placement when somebody comes into the district.
Okay.
So it makes it easier for recruiting, but more difficult on the budget.
Anything else? Anyone else have questions? All right. Thank you. And thank you for the tool. I'm looking forward to having this come back again in the future as we get new years of data.
Of course, yeah. Second interim should be released this month. And so as soon as it's up, I'm going to update everything.
Perfect.
Because I want to see it. All right, thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too, thank you, Manuel.
Okay, we're gonna move on to item,
Is Tammy Montero on there yet? So I think she had a time
right,
to, if we could swap those two items, if you don't mind,
Yep.
just for.
so we're gonna go next to item 3C, the FICMAT discussion item. And we'll come back to 3B. And we have Lisa August presenting.
Hello, so want to welcome Tammy Montero with FICMAT, the Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team, through our partnership with SCO. As we're moving into third interim, Tammy is providing some great assistance for us in helping to make sure that we have a really tight third interim budget report and help us to make sure that that will then set us up going into our budget development moving into next year. So Tammy, if you want to just introduce yourself and share a little bit, that would be fabulous.
Okay, thank you. So hi, I'm Tammy Montero.
Hold on a second.
You can't hear me?
It might be on our end.
Yeah, it might be on our end.
Wait, I'll put on one.
Want me to try again?
The output on the L.
Go ahead, Tammy.
Okay, is this working now? Okay.
Yep.
All right, great. Hi, I'm Tammy Montero. I'm a chief analyst with FICMAT. I was assigned in the for Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team. That's the name of our organization. So at this point, my role with Santa Rosa City Schools and also through a partnership with Sonoma County Office of Education is on-site or virtual technical assistance. So we're not in a fiscal crisis role at this point. This is just a technical assistance, as Lisa pointed out. I'm going to be working closely with Joel and the rest of Lisa's team to try to really talk through assumptions that are being used in the preparation of the third interim. We're going to be looking more at the multi-year projection and the cash flow. Because it's just technical assistance. It's not, there won't be a report or anything issued by us. You're not going to find anything on our website reflecting my opinions or FICMAT's opinions about anything at the district. This is pure technical assistance just to support the district as they move forward with that third interim. And as Lisa mentioned, rolling into the 25-26 budget. So essentially that's it. And I'm here to work with the team for the next month, the rest of this month, I would say. And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
So we wanted to have this item at the beginning of your work just because, this arrangement, this support's somewhat unusual. And so I think we just want to make sure that there was, everyone got to see you, meet you, know that you'd be around, and then also just give an opportunity to discuss how that'll benefit our, what's happening because we're receiving this assistance that's materially important for the district. So Lisa or Tammy, if you can kind of dig a little bit more into what technical assistance means and why that's important for us.
I'll start really quick and then I'll turn it over to you, Lisa, for kind of where you see things for the district. But it's actually not all that unusual for technical assistance to be provided. These are the best kinds of jobs, and it is kind of a behind the scenes thing. It's not usually something that we are talking about in these sort of committees as you have here. I was in another LEA twice this year helping out. That time it was strictly related to position control. And so, usually there's a topic and we're asked to come in and a number of days just to provide support or maybe come in with an outside perspective about how some, process or procedure is taking place, how our assumptions, being arrived at and the like. So for us, we're really looking, I'm really going to be looking more at those foundational assumptions as far as technical assistance is concerned here, related to your enrollment projections, how that translates to ADA, what's going to be happening with that in 25, 26, the local control funding formula calculator, and how the team has been working with that. And then other major changes that you might be looking at for 25, 26, because the third interim, if you haven't seen one before, it's less than the first or second interim as far as the number of papers and forms that you're going to see. It's essentially like your fund forms, your MYP, and your cash flow. So we're not going to see a criterion, standards, and a bunch of those other things. And honestly, the work being done looks a lot like estimated actuals, which is basically half of what is reported on there's two sides of the paper. There's a left side and a right side for your budget. So basically that left side that's called estimated actuals is going to be almost the same numbers as you're going to see here on this third interim. So it's kind of funny because people will say, I don't want to do a third interim, but we tell everybody, well, you kind of already are, because it's called estimated actuals. It's just that you don't have to report it out individually in a different set of forms. So I'm sharing with you from FICMAT's perspective and what the role is that I've been told to do by my organization, and then I'll let Lisa talk a little bit more about how she translates that into the needs of your location.
Yeah, we're super excited to have the additional support. It's always great to have, that fresh look, that second set of eyes, making sure that, okay, we're making assumptions based on our historical data, as well as, some demography studies and what we're seeing actually come in. And then FICMAT, obviously they have a broader sense and can, provide some extra assistance there. Additionally, in fiscal services, we, are pretty slim on staffing. And so the additional support actually working in our financial system, helping us to, identify areas that we can set up proactively so that we don't have to keep going back and making changes retroactively to make adjustments in the budget. So there are a lot of things specific, Tammy mentioned position control. That's a position that is being brought back in a different form starting July 1. So we're hoping that our work together now will set that person up for success, which in turn sets up our budget for success going forward, especially with 80+% of our costs being driven by staffing. So that's a huge piece of it. Looking back and verifying some specific things in our general ledger, cleaning up old things that just kind of get moved from year to year, that kind of hang out there that you don't have time to necessarily get in there and dig deep and do. Those are areas of support that we're really super appreciative for.
Any other questions for Lisa? All right, well, thank you, Tammy. Pleasure to meet you. I hope to see you around, and thank you for all the support you're gonna be giving us.
Yeah, looking forward to working with the team. It was nice to meet everybody.
Thank you.
All right, now we'll move to item 3B, which is the LCAP input session review. And presenting is Roderick Castro and Lisa August.
Yes, hi. Thanks for the opportunity. This year, we are on an accelerated timeline for obvious reasons. We, on Friday, were able to actually post the results of the several, I think it's 5+ sessions that we had, the LCAP revision, but meetings that we had at the different sites. You can actually go to our website. On the main page, there is an LCAP button, and what we did there is I took the results from the Spend a Dot option, from the parking lot open narrative option, and the survey that was open for an entire month that was available at the different events and online. and crunched those and then analyzed all three of those and then created a synthesis. And that really is what we're gonna use, that narrative is what we're gonna use for the revision. Revision and the LCAP is gonna be minimal in terms of what's actually written. And most of what you're seeing, if you take a look at that document, I don't know if you wanna.
Well, that's what I'm looking on here. I'll share the screen, on our main page. Where is it?
If you click on LCAP,
You scroll down, it looks like a big icon.
yeah,
Third one over.
I'm probably totally missing it. Yeah, no, right there. Yes.
and then you click on that and then they'll say LCAP.
Yeah, let me share my screen and then I can, if I can get to it here.
And then LCAP revision feedback results, click here, and then it's like 3 or 4 pages.
Sorry, trying to get into the sharing the screen. Clicked off the ones.
So you see, right there, it says, dear educational partners, and then it shows the 3 bullets, suspended on activity, the parking lot, and then the online survey. And then it goes on and it goes through it, a little bit, and then right there, click here. Yeah. So that is, if you keep staying down, that's the result of the first. The spending out results, then you go to the results of the open narrative, that's the spending out where they actually participated, then it's the open narrative where they could just write what they felt were if our priorities weren't included. And then the last one was the survey, which is kind of a combination short narrative and then they felt about our particular priorities. And then after that, so that's the third option, the online survey, the number of respondents in each category and under each question. And what we get from those is pretty commonly across the board is strong concern about staff reductions, especially the counselors. That's something that was consistent across the board. Counselors, restorative specialists, the FEPs, and then support staff for our multilingual learners. Also, interest in after-school activities, increased after-school activities, differentiated support for students across the board, etc.
I'm not sure where you want to stop, so I'm just
Yeah.
scrolling.
Yeah.
Okay, I see right there.
That's basically it. So we're gonna take this, this right now, we've begun to take and do actual redlining strikeouts of the items that were removed based on, or initially removed based on the RIFs and the PKSs and in the document. And then we'll combine that with this narrative and over the next few weeks, put together the short, like I said, very minimal changes to the document and then yes, that was about a month and a half, bring to the board a revised version of based on what the community.
And just clarification, RIF and PKS, RIFs, reduction in force,
Sorry.
PKS are reductions for particular kinds of service which are specific to credentialing. So specifically talking about the layoff set and reductions that now we can take a look at adding back positions that are specifically identified within these goals. To meet the needs.
So I just want to take a step back on LCAP and where we're at with it. So when I'm talking to folks in the community, I don't think that there is anything remotely close to an understanding of how much LCAP actually means for our school, because it's really the bucket of discretionary funds that we have based on 3 groups of students. And that is our English language learners, our students with certain lower economic means, and our foster students. But that those funds are what we can use in order to increase access to programs with the intent of them focusing on those groups of students, but also with an ability to benefit the entire campus community through providing opportunities for inclusion and such. And so that's, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that is the top line, like, purpose of LCAP.
Well, and then our document actually tends to, in terms of how it's written, our sense of being, and I would say this in our presentations, it's a little more confusing in terms of the way it reads, because ours includes almost everything that we do, even though the funding and the intention of the LCAP, oftentimes you think of LCFF and it's what you just described. But ours reads as a story that includes all of our services.
All of our
Yeah.
Because what we're required to identify in there is at least the supplemental and concentration grant funds
Right.
for in support of those three groups. However, there are a lot of things that we do that that are important to our community. So it's that vehicle by which we describe all of those things.
In a lot of ways, we've used it as a strategic planning document.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. Yeah, you nailed it. That's it.
So my understanding where we're at in the process is that this is actually year 2 of the 3-year cycle.
It's actually the first year.
Yeah, this
First
is, we're going into year 2.
Right, but any changes we're making would be making for year 2.
Yes.
So thinking forward thinking. But we're also recognizing significant changes to how we're providing education for our students across the district. So I think a big question for folks that know what LCAP and LCFF are in the community is, what is big, is it minor revisions because we're in the middle of a 3-year cycle, or is it the potential for big revisions because we have new priorities and all the changes going on in our district? And so I'll stop with that. I'll do the second question second, because so,
So one of the things that wasn't included descriptively in there before was what our base services are. So that's specifically our class size ratios, our counseling ratios, our administrative services, all of those things. The base number or what we determined for our standard staffing was not described in there. So that's going to be a change, is adding that in there and recognizing that it's important to our community that we still provide those some smaller class sizes in our lower grades. And so the difference, say, between what we have in our bargaining agreement at 32-to-1 versus what we actually staff at of 24-to-1 in certain grade levels, that difference could be picked up in our supplemental and concentration based on that's being provided in order to lower class sizes to support our unduplicated pupils. And so that's a descriptor that's going to be captured probably in a different way than we have in the past. Counselors, for example, our standard ratio is 400-to-1 in 7 through 12. And then in the LCAP, we've always had extra, or not always, but since I've been here, we've had elementary counselors included in our LCAP from supplemental and concentration. One of the things that, as Dr. Castro shared, that was highly valued by our community was adding some additional counselor staff at the high school level, specifically related around college and career readiness, or MTSS, those extra support systems.
That was consistent.
Yeah. So because of how we use the word flexible, the funding is, and the changes in the district, I've talked to way more parents and guardians than 30 that responded to the survey around elements, and I feel like there is a disconnect from our community members on that this is a conversation is the conversation around these types of funding and priorities. And so the part of wanting to have this item was to be able to talk openly about where we're at and what people can expect in June. So there's no surprise. There's at least an understanding of what direction we're heading, but also we've had an intense amount of community input over the last 4 months. And I wanted to give us an opportunity to talk about kind of how some of that input, while it wasn't necessarily done in the LCAP meeting or during the survey, but came in over the scope of all these other areas where we had a lot of input, and kind of just give us an opportunity to kind of make sure that those are represented in here. I actually see most of those themes in here, but the counselors as an emphasis is one that I've heard consistently. I see the extracurricular and sports as being a huge theme that I received probably the most after counselors, especially at middle school and, high school campuses. Around, our students gonna have access to extracurriculars. What is that gonna mean? You know, so that's a big thing that I've seen in there is those two. And then and this is a little less focused in here, but I have received, especially in the last 2 weeks, because I think we've been talking about it a little clearer, but a lot of feedback around academic excellence and kind of barriers to things related to that. I saw a little bit in here for advanced learners in commentary, but also just general access for students to like AP tests if they can't afford it, but there isn't like, that they don't have the means to pay for those tests. And those are the kind of three buckets is like academic excellence, the enrichment, in sports, and then the counseling supports that I've been consistently hearing. And I just want to know, is that consistent with everyone else has heard during these last very 4 intense months? And is that what you're seeing in this data also?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the items that you were mentioning before, like athletics and like the money set asides for AP testing existed in previous LCAPs and had to be eliminated. And I don't know about had to be eliminated, but came in lower in priorities for things like adding restorative counselors and adding thefts in previous, just in terms of how priorities shake out, they came in a little lower for previous couple of years ago. And so just like Elisa already says, we can do anything, but we can't do everything. And so things that existed before, there's an ebb and flow, right? Those were where there was money allocated before, and just they didn't make it into this last LCAP. And so there's perhaps a resurgence in terms of priority now, where we may feel a little safer as a community and not do that huge influx. 2 years ago, we had to get all these restoratives to come onto campus. Perhaps that's why.
The post-COVID and the safety swing, we may have overcorrected. And we may need to correct back on some of the more academic related supports that used to exist.
Well,
I'm just saying I'm summarizing what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, for example, in the 23-24 version of the LCAP, because of events that had happened, there was a late in the game shift to add a lot of campus supervisors and different things like that. And in this last year, we've been very intentional with the support of the board and in collaboration with our labor partners with reimagining those positions to be more flexible in our student safety advisor roles, rather than having safety, campus security and restorative, more a blending to provide.
Similar to the AP-VP combination.
Exactly.
So the timeline for this coming back or coming to the board is in June 11th. Our RIFs are going to go into effect on May 15th. And if we're reading the tea leaves, we're intending to have some amount of support for counselors, as well as some of these other things we're talking about where we're seeing there might be adjustments. How does that work with letting folks, go in next week versus?
So now we're taking the time to identify, okay, out of the funds that we have available, how do we prioritize that for these things that have come forward as high priority? And so I would expect that actually we just set a time for us to sit down and look at that, because there are things that we're going to have to add back very quickly in order to meet those deadlines that will have for us to know which positions need to receive a final layoff notice and which don't. So that has to happen within the next week.
So we may, because we don't need to wait for the LCAP in June to be approved.
Correct, because you would see the next action related to the LCAP as far as specific to positions would actually be next Wednesday, when you have the final layoff notices or not. And so that essentially is the board's time to say yes or no on adding those back in when you think of it in that respect.
So for those employees that are worried. We're not saying that we're gonna have a whole another round of adjustments at the end of June.
Correct.
It's gonna be actually baked into what we're considering next week.
Correct.
And I don't think that's clear, so that's.
No, it probably isn't. I don't think that we've messaged that very clearly, that that's kind of because we've talked about when the LCAP comes to the board, we
Right.
haven't talked about the impact or the correlation between the layoff process and timing and the LCAP and the.
Awesome. Do other folks have questions on LCAP? I just have a general. I don't know how we need to do it, but I think if we can more frankly say in future cycles, come and talk about what you want funded at your school. And then we can have LCAP and everything else be more of a sub one, because I think people get confused that this is some type of special funding. And not that it's really what funds what we prioritize as a district. And that's a lot of the feedback I got from folks was they're like, oh, well, that's not us. And it's like, well, it's everyone in some way, shape, or form, especially when you take into consideration how significant of the population. I was having a conversation with the foster parent actually about this around athletics, and they had no concept that they were actually that was actually a part of it in those considerations. So, you know, I think if we can message in the future, not call it the LCAP roadshow or any acronyms, but just say what's important and keep it very much more generic, we'll get a bigger turnout, because I really worry about basing our decisions on this respondent size compared to the responses we've been getting for the last 4 months about what's important to people. And, you know, we've heard articulated at meetings after meetings, and I say all of that with full respect to all the work that's gone into this, because that's a heck of a pivot, and we were trying to do it in the middle of.
Yeah.
LCAP
And
getting
these are
taken
different
down. Yeah.
people too. So
Yeah.
the survey is one group and then.
Yeah, no, yeah, but I just.
I hear what you're saying,
Yeah.
absolutely, because we still struggle with getting parents to come to these meetings.
Right.
We get a small. number
And
of
students, and
Yeah,
we do want
students.
students to come as well.
So I think you're right, if we were to like small caps with the LCAP and larger caps with come tell us how you want the resources that we get from the state and the federal government to help your students in the classroom and use fewer just acronyms across the board. I heard that this time, and we tried to change as we were doing it, try to make it more user friendly every time we went. Right. One of the biggest problems we had this year is just we're just completely out of time.
Yeah, and I mean, I have a couple other thoughts on it that are not able to be done this year, but what we're thinking about next year is also, instead of having everything come to us, you know, there's organizations that support foster youth, and if we went to them to do focus sessions, you know, if we intentionally met with our labor partners, if we meet with the community groups that do provide services on and around our campus, like I think there's a bunch of different ways that we could go to stakeholder groups, where we could solicit input where the people already are, versus hoping that they're going to come to us. And, you know, whether it's sports schedules like we had with the coaches that were trying to make it to the end of that one meeting, but every meeting was during games for the kids, or it's some of the other things. I think if we can go both ways with the community in the future, I think it'll greatly improve the feedback we get.
Yeah, I mean, the local control funding formula started in 2013-14. And before that, the state funded and categorical programs where they decided kind of what the restrictions were. So the local funding form that came with the local control accountability plan saying, we're going to give you the money, and locally you create your local control accountability plan with that money. So I think that's something important to realize, that there's history there that created those acronyms, and I think that was the thinking behind it.
Yeah, and I mean, and the reason for it's great, right? Like we actually have local control over some of the things we do on our campuses versus just administering what we're told to do. But I don't think it's gotten fully ingrained with the community. I'd say in the reverse direction. I think they think that we actually have all the discretion, and they don't realize that this is actually the place that we have it. So I think it's probably the reverse on that. So, you know, it's just, these are all just broad comments. And I mean, I do think it's important that we broaden what we consider input for this year to include and any of the public comments, any of the things that we've heard over the scope of this and not limit ourselves. So I think we've received an amazing amount of input about what's important.
Absolutely.
And with that said, focus on next year for maybe making some of these changes. Anything else? No? So we do have time. We have plenty of time. So I'm gonna go ahead and end this item. Thank you. And then we're gonna take up next time once I get to the screen 4 or 3D, the budget process discussion. But I'm gonna do a quick 2-minute recess because I need something to drink. Perfect. So we'll just reconvene in 2 minutes. Perfect. Thank you.
Bathroom fall.
Actually, I'm gonna step out.
And you have a presentation on this one.
Not presentation. Let me get on.
We'll go ahead and we're gonna reconvene the board finance subcommittee at 4:41. Moving to item 3D. This is our ongoing discussion around budget processes. It's a discussion of the finance committee that's going to lead to proposed revisions for our financial policies and processes sometime over the summer, probably targeting adoption in August, or by adoption, I mean recommendation to the board. So with that, our last discussion on this item, we went through several presentations, but because we didn't have the quorum, we brought back the key decision points that we'll discuss today, as well as a few new topics, and I'll turn it over to Lisa August to present.
Sure, I'll just go ahead and so Kelly Cook provided a copy of the memo that we sent out in January related to bid limits and CUPCA, which is the California Uniform can't remember, Public Construction Cost Accounting. Essentially, it gives us it's a policy and a process that we've adopted that provides for different bid limits than if we hadn't adopted it. If we hadn't adopted it, we'd have to bid anything over $65,000 or $15,000. Sorry, I take that back. So because we do CUPCA for construction, there are different levels for that. Also, some things that we talked about are that for professional services such as audit firms, you're not required to go out to bid. However, it is a best practice. And so Kelly's been gathering some RFP examples, and she did not, in looking back through our items, she didn't find one specific to when we've gone out in the past. But this is just some information specific to when we do have to go out to bid, or when we can do informal versus formal bidding processes and procedures.
And for context, this is coming back from our last conversation, because one of the points for us to consider is if we want to have a board policy around requiring that we rebid our auditor after so many years, and we currently don't have any policy on it. And it, based on our last presentation, would be considered a best practice for us to establish a policy. So Trustee Kirby, I believe you're with us, and Trustee
Yes.
Valley. Yeah. So, so for that specific one around the auditing, do we have questions around if we'd want to have that, why we'd have it, just any?
Why would we have it?
Why would we have it? As far as a policy, or what? Again, just to ensure, set a time frame of every however many years the board would like, that we go back out and competitively bid. Doesn't mean when you're doing an RFP, or an RFQ is a request for proposal or request for qualifications for professional services. It's really to say, okay, here's the parameters of what we're looking for, and then you have packets that are submitted by different firms so that you can, it doesn't have to be the lowest bid when you're looking at those services. It may be who's the right fit It's not necessarily a bad thing to change up your auditors over a period of time. Within law, you can only have the lead auditor, so for so many years in a row, and then they have to trade out. You can do that within the same firm though, which is what our firm does. Siobhan Associates, they do swap out that lead person on a regular basis. So we're not constantly repeating that. We're in compliance, but it's not always a bad idea to go out and again see what other firms are offering, what their total package cost is, or the level of service, just all of those things. We have not been unhappy with our auditors. So it's not anything like that. It is just.
We get to talk about it when it's not an urgent issue.
Exactly. Now, one thing is that we do have, so our auditors are secured through June 30th, 25 audit. So that means next year, they're already under contract to audit this year. But if we want to go out for the request for proposals, that would need to start probably in the summer for us to be prepared for the following year.
If we chose to do it immediately.
Exactly.
So
Otherwise, we can always negotiate it. We do have contracts that we sign with them, for, typically about 3 years, I think is what we've done typically.
I think one thing around why we would do it is the auditor is really, for us as the board, the only way to truly get an independent opinion on the kind of worst types of financial malfeasance that could occur around fraud, around those types of elements. And you look at the really big examples of where auditing failures, failed. And it was almost always because of the auditing firm, either knowing how to, not existing, or the auditing firm having such a comfortable relationship with the entity they're auditing that the assumptions were made that shouldn't have been, or just things were done wrong. And I mean, the biggest example, of course, is Enron. As far as where that happened, but us having a policy where we're revisiting is also the board having a policy where even talking about the auditor becomes a part of our procedures, because it'll come up to the board and we'll have to approve a new auditor. And the thing is the 99% of the time that auditing is working, it's working because we don't need to see it. So it also triggers us having to actually have that conversation about who's the auditor, what is it we're looking for in an auditor, does it make sense to stick with our current auditor, which won't happen proactively unless something happens bad.
Is this something that other boards do?
Yeah.
Other
schools.
schools, it's not uncommon to at least have it either as a policy or as a practice that every so often, and I would say it's probably every 5 to 10 years, depending. I wouldn't recommend going 10 years without taking a look at it. I would probably say every 5 years would be a good time to go out and do it. And again, you may end up with the same audit firm when all things compared.
You made a good comment that the audit does really work for the board members.
And the public.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be my comment, Lisa, was, the fact that we're putting out the RFP doesn't necessarily preclude the fact that we may end up with the same auditor, right? It's just that we're putting it out to see what's out there, so to speak.
Folks have other questions? My general sentiment was every 5 years was probably, 3 years is also another timeline to 5 years. And I'm thinking not next year, I'm actually thinking the year after. If we do a 1 year, just not put another thing on our plates. for next
Yeah,
year?
in RFPs, going through, evaluating the proposals, it is a time consuming. It does actually use up quite a bit in the way of resources. You could also look at a 7-year or something like that, where,
Mhm.
you maybe end up with two kind of 3-year cycles and,
What should you recommend?
I would probably recommend 7 because of the time frame. That as far as the process to have it happen. Also, it is helpful to have auditors who get to know over a couple of years. They actually tend to then be able to dive a little bit deeper after they've been with you for a couple of years, but then you don't want to go too long without having that too. So
Mm.
kind of a sweet spot. That's my thought. Joel, do you have
Sense of.
comments on that too?
Any other thoughts, 7 years?
5 sounds fine, but so this, just something we would recommend to the rest of the board?
Also, the whole budget process we're going through here and we're giving these pieces of feedback, so I have to now remember what we did at the first meeting.
Talked about looking at for next year, the finance subcommittee wanted to recommend something to the policy committee to take a look at. If I remember correctly, relate, because the policies around specifically the threshold for approval for
That's right.
superintendent. Or, what do you want to see come to the board versus what do you want to see, what do you want to see on consent versus on action?
So each of these conversations we're having, I'm tracking kind of these straw polls that we're talking about. And then we're gonna look at putting them into a proposal for the finance policies to recommend to the board. So like, we're not gonna take each of them individually, but because we want to do a deep dive on each part of our budget process and finance process. And then we capture those, and then if there are changes that need to be made, then we'll package them together and bring them to the board. So this would go along with kind of the contract thresholds and some of the other things that we're talking about. We have another one on here, reserve policies, stuff like that. So right now I'm getting kind of a sense that a straw support for, you're saying 5 years? Like for every 5 years on it. So we'll track that and we'll put it in. It all comes back to us before we send it up, so we'll be able to do some more edits.
And we can come back, we'll look for some sample policies.
And I believe the next topic on here is internal controls.
And I do believe, let's see, it looks like that. So if we go to actually the other items, I'm sorry. I had thought that we added the FICMAT internal control checklist to the standing information item, but I'm actually not seeing it. So let me pull that up and we can get it added maybe in the minutes and then in the future. So give me just a second to find it here.
Okay.
We go to the FICMAT website and I'll pull it up that way and then people can actually see. And if where we go to find some great tools and information. This is all publicly available. Go over here. Fiscal tools. Internal control checklist. So this is actually very similar to the to what happens in an audit, what the auditors look at, because that's really, as you said, what that's all about. So FICMAT, what County of Montero works, is they put out, it's funny, this actually came out, I think, the day after our last finance subcommittee. So it is now in here linked so that you can look at the background, all of that, lots of information about what the different pieces are for internal controls, which really this is how we make sure that we are processing things correctly, accurately, and make sure there's not fraud or misappropriation or anything like that. And so there's a checklist. So governance, there's a section about this related to the fiduciary duty of the board. What's acceptable business policies, code of conduct policies.
Out of curiosity,
Form
for that first
700.
question there, what
Yes.
would your answer be?
What's that question?
What are fiduciary responsibilities?
So I believe, I feel like our board actually is looking very closely at, and considering the fiduciary responsibility related to, there are the conversations, the actions that have been taken this year really are about the overall sustainability and fiscal health of the district into the future. So again, fiduciary responsibility is not to an individual subset, it's the overall health of the district. So I would say each of us, we have a new set of board members, and so we haven't probably gone as deep as we could into some of these. We have not had an opportunity to do a board retreat, strategic planning, that kind of thing, where this would really probably have a deeper dive. And management understand LA's acceptable business practices, policies, allowable uses of resources. I would say depends on how you define that. I would say because you have different areas that have very specialized spending, yes, there's an understanding within that subset of what they can spend. But as far as and overall, that may not be something that we've communicated as well as far as specific resources, as a whole. So, Form 700 is definitely an important factor. Organizational structure, assignment of authority and responsibility, our organizational chart. We do need to update that again, as that's kind of always an annual thing that we do a little bit of an update. I would say that these are areas that we're providing clarity, that it hasn't always been super clear. And Joel, hop in here if you disagree on any of those, or if there's anything
from my
that you want.
perspective, so
Yeah.
we've got, one strong tool we use is our escape financial management tool, which has human resources as well. So it has the positions by job classification, and it also has structure of approval authorities for all the requisitions or employee reimbursements, different things like that. That I think the area where we could find some improvement in this regard is position control. And then the other component, we do have our board policy that shows purchasing requirements and all the spending limits, and we follow those procedures. So I think those are the main areas where we do have it's fair to say robust, or not as robust, where we've got internal controls as far as and that is what the auditors look at. They look at our policies, and they look at so they'll pull samples of all of our expenditures, and they'll say, okay, did this go through the full requisition process, approved by all the required approvers, and they'll pull payroll samples. Okay, did we pay this person supplemental pay? Did they go through our full employee authorization process for that approval? Get the time card and keep that package for records. And then they look at and then they look at funding sources, were those some allowable uses of those funds. And so I mean I think there are areas where we can improve our policies as far as setting stronger or not. Okay, let me rephrase my language here. So look at, like, for example, limits of spending, like what does need to go to the board for a contract approval or, but yeah, we do have.
As a tool, this checklist, is it something that we could incorporate as, because part of what we're talking about in this budget process is this committee's role.
Mhm.
Is this checklist a tool that we could use to evaluate our internal controls on like an annual basis? In order to answer these key questions or a base, use this as a guide for that?
Yes, and in fact, I think Jessica turned this into a spreadsheet for
Oh,
us,
beautiful.
so that we can.
We're already doing it. Got it.
Yes, absolutely. Yep, as soon as it came out. Our team
Excellent.
was on it,
Okay.
so that we can actually use that as a guiding factor. A lot of the questions are things that need to be answered by us
Right.
as the team, but there are answers that need to come from, that would be,
Mhm.
gonna come from the board as well. It talks about the turnover in management, authority delegated, responsibly, and responsibility assigned in a clearly defined way, which we know that that's not one that's clearly defined in our policies. So,
So we didn't have a chance to fully review this. I don't want to just review it on the screen. So we can send the link around.
we will add it to the minutes. I did, send this actually in a board weekly, but I can.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I thought I
A
read it.
while back, but I can
Well, and
provide
if-
it again.
And if we can look at it as we're thinking about
Mhm.
things, there's probably some prompts in here for us to
Yep.
dig into further.
Here we go, right here, ties right into our conversation earlier.
Yeah, the
Related to
LCAP.
the LCAP and multi-year projection.
Any other questions on this one? Trustee Kirby?
Nothing right now. No, it looks very helpful. I'm looking forward to incorporating that.
All right, and then our last of the budget process discussions for today is around establishing a reserve and one-time fund policy. We do not currently have a reserve or one-time fund usage policy. It's something that does exist in other districts. It exists in lots of different ways. But if you could introduce it and the pros and cons, and then I can take the discussion where it goes.
So and the variety of reserves across the state really vary, and the requirements for reserves. Our minimum required is 3%, and that's based on the size of our district and our budget. And that is, when you think of the reserve and 3%, that is not necessarily cash on hand. That is the ending fund balance. And when you think of especially what's happened during COVID, where there were a lot of federal dollars that were required to be expended first and then reimbursed, that actually draws down your actual cash on hand prior to you receiving it. So reserve is not necessarily a guarantee of cash in the bank. So that's something to keep in mind. A 3% reserve is less than 2 weeks of payroll. So that's, when you think of it in those terms, it would be probably a little scary for somebody running a business to know that they didn't have, more than 2 weeks of payroll, let alone other operating expenses. So thinking of it, that's not even including our, utilities, our, all of the other things that we have. We also have constraints that back in, say it was probably in 2015, I think, during the state budget negotiation, that the governor at the time negotiated essentially a reserve cap. And so under specific conditions, districts have a cap of 10%, so it cannot hold more than 10% in assigned or unassigned reserve. However, there are caveats to that. If the board takes action to specifically commit funds, you can have more than the 10% because it's, okay, we have this strategic initiative that we want to set funds aside for and have that earmarked. That's separate from the 10% cap. So
The 10% caps only in effect in years where the states funded the reserve for Prop 98.
Right. Yeah,
Which
there's
was
that,
not, which hasn't happened recently.
no, it was in effect for
2 years
last
ago.
year. It's not in effect for
Okay.
this year. Yeah, so there's. And that was the first time it was triggered since its inception. So
I have a dumb question. So are we considering a policy for a minimum or for a cap? Or both, or either?
A
Minimum.
minimum, a
Okay.
minimum, because your 3% really is not. That is. If we are only ever aiming for 3%, we are going to always be in the situation of needing to make reductions whenever there's a bump in the economy, you know, a bump in the financial stability. If we have a higher than 3%, that allows you to ease it. So, you know, some of the things that people have asked us to do is to pause some of the reductions, to, you know, slow down and step into things. If we had a larger reserve, we could do that. We don't have that reserve to give us that space. And so we are having to make reductions or, you know, transitions into some pretty big transitions in a very short period of time because we don't have that financial cushion to slow that down.
So if we created a policy now, while we don't have that money, would we just be trying to reach that? And then once we reach it, we don't spend out of that?
Yes. And so that's pretty standard. There's usually it's called a fiscal stabilization plan. And so, yes, we have our fiscal stabilization plan as far as for budget reductions, but there's actually a policy that we can adopt that talks about what that plan, you know, when you have funds that are directed to a specific reserve for meeting that reserve policy. So it's,
So some examples I've seen are like. Until the reserve target is met. X percentage of unrestricted one-time funds or X percentage of COLA increases are dedicated to the reserve until the reserve is met. After the reserve is met, then you can allocate fully. That way you're slowly building up to the target reserve so that you then have those funds available. It's a part of why this is labeled reserve and one-time fund policy, because it was more on the one-time fund policy, also like specify positions as being short-term or attached to the length of the fund, so you don't have to then release people that didn't realize there was a short-term position. But the other part of it is when you get one-time funds that are restricted, or you get a COLA, you take a small chunk of it and you put it into the reserve until we hit that goal. So, and passing it now doesn't solve today's fiscal challenges or next year's, but it does. If we start the process now, then eventually we'll be in a place where we have it so that we can have more stability. And I mean, another example is just simply what's happening with the COLA this year, right? We started at 2.9 in I think it was end of December, and we're now down to a 2.34, I think.
it was, 2.43 in the January budget
Yeah, it's about
proposal,
to go
and now it's 2.3 is what the actual,
2.3.
the statutory COLA is.
Right.
So what it's required to be in law, that does not mean that they have to fund the COLA. So hopefully they do, but there's a possibility.
It could
with-
go even lower.
Yes.
Yeah, with the LA fires and with the stock market issues.
Yeah.
So just from January to today, what we're anticipating for COLA changes is 0.5%. If we had a reserve, we could say, we'll use a little reserve, we'll use, but we've,
To smooth though.
but we don't
just
have the ability to
smoothly.
smooth. So unfortunately, it won't help us today, but also if we don't talk about the policy, we won't have it to help in the future, so.
And that ties back into that fiduciary responsibility, is looking for the long-term health of fiscal health of the district.
Questions around, or questions, thoughts, curiosities?
My feeling is I would like to initially set our goal at I'd like to double what's required of the minimum, like get a 6% reserve. And initially, I'd love to see it at 7.5% as a final goal for us, but knowing that may be a hard row to hoe. A row, yeah.
So,
Anyway,
just as an
I
example
would like to
for,
see it.
Trustee Greer, just as an example for benchmarking, like the city of Santa Rosa's target reserve is around 17%.
Which is
Wow.
about 2 months of operating expenses, which is what, when you're in a basic aid district, they, so where they're community funded because of the cash flow, they don't get their funds until really December, January, when tax receipts come in, they need a larger reserve. And that's a pretty common, the 17% is common for that type of district. We're a little bit different, but with the reserve cap, if I were to recommend one to have, it would be that we have that 10%. Because then that helps when you end up in a recession or something like that, that can keep you from having to gut programs. And, you know.
One of the biggest challenges when they remove the reserve cap, it's because the economy's bad. And the state can't fund their reserve. And so it's like the reason for the removal of the reserve cap is we may need to have a higher reserve, but we wouldn't have been allowed to build a higher reserve during the years where we would have been able to. So I find that entirely backwards. With that said, I mean, 10% really is,
It would take us a long time.
it's gonna
get
take us
there,
years to get there.
But
So,
that's, I mean, it's an aspirational goal, but really, if you're talking about for stability and cash flow, that is actually a strong reserve in the size district that we have with the constraints of the cap. So that would not be identifying additional funds as committed for specific purposes and specifically reserved for. Again, it would be up to the board to actually make that determination, but looking at it from that perspective, and I don't know how our labor partners feel about that. I know it feels probably scary on their end when we talk about increasing that reserve, because they're going to see that as less funds available when you're talking about, you know,
This year's
looking
expenditure.
and looking at cost of living and all of those things. So it's finding that balance of how do we get there and what time span and bringing them on as partners to talk about that.
and what I'd suggest we do is, so a 10% goal sets the vision where we want to go. How we get there is what we would be wanting to do around the percentage of one-time funds or percentage of COLA when they come in for a policy. And so my thought would be that when we bring back the proposals, we bring back a specific proposal on that has been talked with our partners and labor and has been kind of vetted against how other districts have grown it successfully. Because they want to set a target that we can actually do.
Right.
So, you know, we don't want to say put the entire COLA in there until we get there, because feasibly that's not going to happen.
Yeah. We wouldn't be able
you
to
know,
operate if we did that.
Exactly. But we do want to make sure that we're taking the opportunities when those one times or the COLAs come in to make sure we're putting some in each time. And so my thought is we target the goal, but then based off of how much we're contributing to it with input, that would give us a sense of when we've achieved that goal. So, does that, Mark, does that work?
All right, sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would love 10%. I was just trying to be maybe a little more realistic, basically on what we were saying. But yeah, sure, I'm 100% down for 10% eventually.
I'm just wondering about timing of when we can start to have this conversation when there's already so much chaos with the cuts we've made already.
One that's a part of packaging kind of all of these important but not urgent policies together around the auditing. Doing this is we're looking at the foundational budget issues that don't address today's crisis and resolutions and changes, but if we never start working on these things, they're never going to get done because there's always going to be the next urgent crisis. And so, similar to the auditor, would we trigger the first contribution being this next fiscal year, or would we say that we're putting the contributions in the reserve fund to be effective in the future one? I think there's room for us to do that. But the impetus and the importance is that if we don't set the structure and the intent now, we're going to continue not getting to it. Which I know it's hard to talk about, right? Because we got everything before us, but
Yeah.
next year we're gonna have everything before us again.
Right, and the reality is, from my seat, I wouldn't recommend that we implement it for next year, or even, the year after, maybe, because of just knowing,
Next year, we may be just looking to not have our bond interest money as a part of our 3% reserve. That would be my goal for next year. Well, and then we can go, so we can take baby steps, but I think we need to lay out where we're going and what those steps are going to be, so that when we get there, they're happening. Yeah.
Yep.
But I hear that concern. I really do. Yeah. All right. All good with 10% as the goal, but come back with the options around what we do for implementation.
Yeah.
All right. I don't have anything else on here. We kind of kept this item light because the LCAP and the FICMAT, we weren't sure how long it was going to go. So we're not going to be able to finish our budget process work in the June meeting. We're going to end up having an extra going to August, but I think that's similar to needing to be nimble for current issues. This is the one item that we're keeping on to focus on that Stephen Covey would call the not urgent but important items. So we're going to keep this going and with our next month meeting, and then in August. I'm going to slightly preview our intent to receive a report in June, going over what the intended process is going to be for updating the facilities master plan. So I know Lisa's and the team are working on that, and it wouldn't be us giving commentary on the master plan. It's just going to be us receiving a report on what that timeline of that process is going to be. I mean, there's a lot of questions in the community about that, so just this meeting will have that on its next agenda, where we can ask some of those questions about when, how this happened. So with that, is there any other comments before we close the meeting? All right, then we'll go ahead and.
Want to do the approval minute?
All right, we actually have one second. Sorry.
Are we able? to-
Yeah. So trustee Kirby will be abstaining.
Okay, I think there's one that I was not present for.
That one was only me, so it wasn't actually an official meeting. We're just receiving the minutes as the report of that meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think we can actually have it as minutes.
So not, maybe not do B5.
5B. Yeah, let's not have, let's just change it to receipt of notes.
Yeah. We'll put that in the minutes.
Because we did do the meeting in order to have all the information in there as a part of the record, so everyone should review that. It had a lot of conversation about what led into today, but so it's a committee meeting, so I actually, this chair can make motions, but that you make motions, I'll second them for A and C.
Move to approve.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, we have 2 ayes and 1 abstention,
Abstain.
approving items 5 and C.
Thank you.
All righty,
Thank you.
and then we've received the notes from our gathering on April 7th.
Perfect.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.